Hello, so I'm Tamsyn Ellway from the Environment Agency. So it's nice to see a few familiar communities here. So I'm a flood resilience advisor, so I work with communities to help them become more resilient to flooding, help develop flood plans. So I will be talking about how we forecast flooding, how that translates into flood warnings, and how community groups can help with those flood warnings. And then Joe is also here. He will be talking about future flood risk projects in Cambridgeshire. Okay, so the two don't really go together, but never mind. So just we're going to cover how we forecast flooding, the flood warning service, how community flood groups can help, and then the projects. So the Environment Agency works closely with the Met Office, and we have a joint flood forecasting centre down in Exeter. And so every day they're monitoring the weather, and they are running models several times a day using their big fancy supercomputers that they have. So with that, they produce several products that are then sent to us at the Environment Agency. So we have the Flood Outlook there, which is kind of a longer term view. And then we also have, going down to 5 days, the flood guidance statement. So the flood guidance statement is separated out into counties, and it will highlight areas at risk using kind of a matrix. So green means low risk, it goes yellow, amber, all the way up to red as well. And so depending on what colour they colour the county, then influences what we as the Environment Agency would do, and also what the local flood authority or the district council as well what plans they'd put into place. The data that they use to generate those products is it's a mixture of kind of radar data. We've got that one there. We also use rain gauges there, flow gauges, which is that one there, and then what we call depth gauges. Okay, and we have quite an extensive system throughout the rivers that will feed back that data 24 hours a day. So from those rain gauges and those depth and flow gauges, all that information goes into a big system which we call the Incident Management Forecasting System. So this you can see covers the whole country, and every blue triangle is a gauge, and where that has exceeded a certain threshold is where you'll see the triangles there. Sorry if this is a little bit technical. So obviously no model, no prediction is 100% accurate. So there is always kind of a degree of uncertainty with these things. Just a bit of a closer look at Cambridge. Again, that shows all the gauges there. And then from those gauges, we then create these hydrographs, which then creates a forecast for us. So you can see the blue line on that top graph is the actual, what actually is being recorded. And then the purple line is what is being forecast. So obviously the forecast model for that is over-predicting a little bit there. So then we take these forecasts at the model, and then we translate these into flood warnings, which you as residents or as communities will receive. So model outputs are generated, and then in some locations throughout the country, you can actually log on and see the raw model outputs. However, we aren't doing that just here yet. So what happens here is that the raw model outputs from that forecasting system is then interpreted and adjusted by a flood forecaster. So they use their knowledge of the catchment and what's happening in that area to then adjust the model. And then flood warning duty officers use this adjusted information and other factors to issue the flood warnings. And the flood alerts and warnings contain our best information. And then flood warning duty officers contact affected flood groups coordinators to give forecast information. So there's 4 different levels of flood warning codes that we issue from the Environment Agency. So the lowest level of warning is the flood alert. So this can be issued up to 2 days in advance. These cover quite a large area. And this is where you'd expect to see kind of roads starting to flood, or you might see some fields starting to flood. So this just gives you a bit of a heads up that the catchment is really saturated and that the water now has nowhere to go, it's starting to lay on top of the fields. The next warning up is the flood warning, which is when we expect property to flood. So this is when you would take action to start protecting yourselves and your property. And then up to the final level, which is the severe flood warning. So these are issued quite infrequently, and it's where there's a significant risk to life. They're kind of issued where it's a kind of multi-agency decision to issue one of them as well. So I'm just going to show you some examples, and some places you might recognise. So this is kind of what you'd expect to see on a flood alert. So it's flooding of low-lying land and roads. So you can see the fields are starting to fill up there. And then this is at the flood warning level. So flooding of property is expected. So this was Alconbury Weston in 2020 and Harold in Bedfordshire. And then this is what we mean by severe flood warning, where there is a risk to life. Obviously that's a coastal one there, that was Hemsby in Norfolk 2014. And then this is a caravan site that was down in Kent. So obviously those caravans just turn into kind of floating weapons, really. So all this information, so the flood warning service, for people who are signed up, you get a text message or you get a phone call to you, and it's an automated phone call, and a text message, email as well. But there's also lots of information available online that you can find this out. So on our gov.uk flood pages, you can see what flood warnings and flood alerts are in force around the country. It can also give you the flood forecast for the next 5 days. So that's very similar to the product from the Met Office that I showed you at the beginning. So you can get similar information there. You can also look at river levels online, which is on that far end there. Obviously when I took this screenshot, there hasn't been a lot of rain recently, so it's quite flat, but during a flood you'd obviously see that blue line start to go up. Community groups are a source of information as well. So we contact community coordinators in those affected locations first, usually before we would issue a flood warning, just to give them a bit of a heads up that it's getting towards kind of the flood warning level, and to get their support in that as well. And then that's all. We also do social media, so most of our flood warnings and flood alerts are available on our Twitter page. So how community flood groups can help? So they can help disseminate those flood warning messages. So not everyone who's at risk of flooding will be signed up to receive alerts, or they may have got that phone call and just thought it was someone trying to sell them something and hung up on them. So it's really useful to have a community flood group that can share those flood warning messages with them, particularly ones where they're vulnerable, or they're quite elderly, they might not understand, or they might panic. Community flood groups can also act as our eyes and ears on the ground. So the Environment Agency can't be everywhere. We can view all the gauges, but that necessarily isn't a true picture of what's happening in a community. Those gauges can break, so it's really important though that we have that two-way conversation with community groups who can alert us to anything that is going on. Again, kind of when it isn't flooding, flood groups can help educate residents on the difference between flood alerts and flood warnings. We have a few places where they've started to kind of put in their temporary defences or something on a flood alert level, and they've started to panic, and there's no need to do that, and I think they were getting confused between what a flood alert means and what a flood warning means, and so kind of having that, being able to educate the wider community on the difference and what action needs to be taken at what level can really help them as residents. You can also act as a collective voice. I suppose that's what goes back to Charles's presentation. As a flood group, they are a much more powerful organisation than just one person on their own. They can identify vulnerable residents and inform relevant agencies. So if you know someone in your community who might need some extra medical attention or might be disabled, then at least you can alert the right people at the time. Again, promote sign up to flood warning service, and finally data collection after a flood. So after a flood has happened, we spend a long time collecting that data, working out how high it came to, at what time, and all that helps to improve the flood warnings for the future. Like, was our flood warning accurate? Did it give the residents enough time to prepare? Did you receive it too late? Did you receive it too early? So once we have that data, we can then make improvements for next time. That data also leads on to bigger projects, and it helps kind of get funding for other projects as well. So community groups can help us by gathering that data, even if it's just photographs or kind of measuring the height of things. It's all really useful. And then just quickly to plug one of my projects. So I also run the Community Flood Kit project. So for any communities that set up as a flood group, create a flood plan and have some volunteers, we do have some funding available. It's about up to £1,500 per community, and it can go on a variety of equipment that would help you respond during a flood. So whether that's kind of high-vis jackets or hydro sacks, first aid kits, it can be kind of tailored to what your needs are. So yeah, we can do that. So if anyone is interested, then just contact me and we can work out the best way how we can get you some equipment. Sorry if I've rattled through that, but happy to take questions later on. Hand over to Joe.
Thanks, Tamsyn. Good morning, everyone. So yeah, as Tamsyn said, my name's Joe Pugsley. I'm a flood risk advisor at the Environment Agency, and I've been asked to talk to you about some of the current and future flood risk projects that we are currently working on in Cambridgeshire. So to begin with then, I'm just going to start with this slide, which sort of gives an overview of the total project expenditure for projects within Cambridgeshire that are on the capital programme. So that includes Environment Agency projects, Lead Local Flood Authority projects, Local Authority projects, and also the Internal Drainage Board projects, so all flood risk management authorities. And it includes projects that are for capital maintenance schemes, so where we're doing sort of significant maintenance on structures, and other things like property flood resilience measures, as well as the traditional sort of flood defence schemes that we're working on. It's important to point out that so these figures are based on the current consented programme, and it represents sort of our current aspirations of what we'd like to deliver on the current capital programme. The programme's refreshed annually, so it's updated each year as more information is known about the proposed projects, the costs associated with those, the viability of those projects, and also the need for those projects, because that obviously changes over time as we get more understanding. So really it provides an overall picture of the funding that's allocated to projects within Cambridgeshire and the benefits that are associated with them. And when we're developing the capital programme, we work with communities to develop projects that are included on there. And today I'm just going to talk about four projects, or 4 examples of where we've been working on projects within Cambridgeshire. So I'll begin then just by talking about the Alconbury Brook, the Alconbury Brook project that we're working on. As Charles mentioned earlier, the villages of Alconbury and Alconbury Weston have an extensive history of flooding, notably in 1998, which is shown on this image here. So this is Alconbury Weston in 1998, and then more recently in the winter of 2020-21. And again, this is Alconbury Weston in January 2021. The catchment of the Alconbury Brook is fairly flashy in comparison to the wider River Great Ouse catchment, meaning that the Alconbury Brook reacts quickly to rainfall. And at present there are no formal flood defences within the villages. So through the Alconbury Brook project, we're aiming to deliver a scheme that will reduce the risk of flooding to both villages. And so just a little bit of a summary on where we've got to this point. So through a review of previous appraisals that have been done for the villages and the development of some new ideas, we've developed an initial list of potential options for a scheme. Amongst other things, these have included things like options for flood storage upstream, which Charles mentioned earlier, and the map on the left of the slide provides an indication of where that could be, and as well as other things like channel improvement works, diversion channels and channel reprofiling. And throughout that process of developing those options and pulling that information together, the input that we've had from the Alconbury Flood Group has been really hugely valuable to us. They provided with lots of information to help build our knowledge of past flooding and the impacts of that, as well as reviewing the initial sets of scheme options and providing feedback on those to help us refine that down into a shorter list. So once we'd reached the point where we'd established a short list of options for the project, we then held a drop-in event in the summer to present those options to the community, and that gave us an opportunity to obtain some more valuable feedback and understand preferences on each of the different options that we presented. It's worth pointing out at this point that the assessment of the options that we'd done had all been fairly high level, so it included lots of estimates on what the benefits were likely to be and assumptions made about the economic viability. So we're now reviewing that detail of where we are with the options and whether we can progress those to the next stage of the project. So if we can find a viable solution, that will be taken forward into a strategic outline case for us then to go and seek funding to obtain for the next stage of the project. So that's a very quick overview of the work we're doing on the Alconbury Brook scheme. Moving on to talk about St Neots and what we're doing there. So the first part of this work was a study that was undertaken in 2020-21 to assess to assess potential betterment opportunities across the new A428 route. So for some context, this is a map showing the new A428 route, where you've got the purple line showing the route, the proposed route, which is from the Black Cat roundabout to the south of St Neots and then over to Capstan Gibbet towards Cambridge. And you can see that the route crosses several watercourses. So you've got the River Great Ouse, which is the light blue line, and then you've got the Hen Brook, which is the red line, Wintringham Brook, which is the green line, and Fox Brook, which is the orange line. So the purpose of the project was to explore whether the new A428 could act as a barrier to reduce flood flow, conveyance and associated flood risks to St Neots from two tributaries by storing water in the upper reaches of the Hen Brook and Wintringham Brook. So the outputs from the study demonstrated that it was really vast volumes of flood storage would be required, and that was beyond what could be provided by the A428 scheme. That would have been sort of beyond what could be provided by the scheme to offer flood risk benefit in the lower sections towards St Neots. So that element of the project couldn't be progressed. However, the study also highlighted some key wider issues, such as the influence of the River Great Ouse on the Hen Brook, and also brought together key partners with the Environment Agency. So the list on there, we've got different authorities involved in flood risk management in St Neots, and then also other organisations like Natural England and National Highways. Although we weren't able to progress with the initial idea, which was potentially looking at the option to store water in line with the new A428 scheme, the recommendation that came out of the study means that we're now able to take a sort of a holistic approach to slowing the flow from upstream in the Hen Brook catchment before it reaches St Neots town centre, and that includes looking at options for natural flood management techniques in the upper rural catchment of the Hen Brook. Moving on then to the work that we're looking at in St Ives. There's a history of flooding in St Ives, as with all these locations, and for St Ives, we're talking about the history of flooding associated with Parsons Drove Drain, which is the main river that flows along the eastern edge of St Ives. There's a number of other ordinary water courses that that influence that as well. And the overall aim of the project is to identify some options for measures that are ultimately economically viable and acceptable to the community that will reduce the risk of flooding. But we need information to support that work, and we need evidence to progress the project. So the initial part has involved reviewing and updating the hydraulic model that we have for Parsons Drove Drain to ensure that it accurately reflects the risk of flooding as we understand it. And it's really important to ensure that we're confident in the outputs of the model so that it can be used to assess options to reduce the risk of flooding in St Ives. The map on the left shows sort of what the existing modelling that we had for Parsons Drove Drain looked like. So it comprised of two different models, one for the upper part, which is shown with the orange line, where you've got Parsons Drove Drain on the right-hand side, and then also the Houghton Field Drain, which flows through St Ives, and then a downstream section. So we had two different models for one watercourse. So what we've done is now we've consolidated that model into one model for the entire watercourse, and also included updated information. So where we've got some new survey to reflect channel dimensions and new data from the December 2020 flood event. Once we finalised that work and finalised all of the modelling work, we'll then be in a position where we can consult the local community to help identify a long list of options that we can then take forward to look at and look at some options to hopefully reduce the risk of flooding, and we can assess those in more detail. And then finally, the final location I just wanted to talk about was Girton. Again, there's a long history of flooding in Girton associated with the Beckbrook and Washpit Brook. So you've got Washpit Brook, which sort of flows immediately to the west of Girton, and then the Beckbrook, which is sort of further west, and then both of those watercourses meet in the village. And property flooding was seen here in 1978, 2001 and 2012. And the Girton Flood Alleviation Scheme project that we're working on aims to identify and deliver a scheme to reduce the risk of flooding. So in a similar position to where we've been with St Ives, there were major changes to the catchment following recent A14 works and development at Eddington. And so it was decided that we needed to undertake some new modelling work to provide an accurate representation of flood risk in Girton. And that work's now been completed. So following the completion of that modelling work, we're now appraising options to mitigate flood risk in Girton, and are in discussions with local stakeholders and communities about potential next steps. We've developed a long list of options with assistance from the local community. None of those options are sort of, that list isn't set in stone at the moment, but it includes things like options for some built defences, natural flood management, flood storage, property level resilience, channel improvements, and also enhanced maintenance. So there's a number of different things that we're looking at. And over the coming months, we'll be assessing those options to understand their economic viability and whether they can be progressed to the next stage of the project. So that's a very quick overview of the work that we're doing in Girton. So that's sort of all I wanted to talk to you about today. I think Tamsyn and I are happy to take any questions. I think that the main message from me would be, as I've sort of discussed with all of these projects we work on, it's really useful, and we really value the input that we get from communities, and we need that information not only to get feedback on the options we're looking at, but also for the local knowledge and information that you can provide on local flood risk.